The global order just drew a line in the sand, and Donald Trump is standing on the wrong side of it. While American media obsesses over domestic scandals and culture wars, something far more consequential is unfolding on the world stage. A coordinated pushback against U.S. unilateralism that signals a fundamental restructuring of global power. We're witnessing the acceleration of a multipolar world where nations that Washington once commanded are now charting independent courses. From BRICS expansion to alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar, from energy deals that ignore American sanctions to security pacts that exclude NATO, the message is clear. The era of unquestioned American hegemony is over, and Trump's return to power isn't reversing this trend, it's catalyzing it. Leaders across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and even Europe are making calculated moves, building economic and diplomatic infrastructure that insulates them from Washington's demands. This isn't just political theater or temporary friction. This is a tectonic shift in how global power operates, and understanding it is essential to grasping where the world is actually headed. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening right now, because the corporate media in the United States is doing everything in their power to obscure this reality. We are living through one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in modern history, and yet, if you turn on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, you'll hear endless discussions about Trump's latest tweet or some manufactured controversy designed to keep you distracted. Meanwhile, the actual architecture of global power is being rewired, and the United States is increasingly finding itself on the outside looking in. Think about what we've witnessed just in the past few years. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the original BRICS nations, have expanded their bloc to include countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This isn't some symbolic gesture or talking shop for disaffected nations. This is the formation of an alternative power center that represents roughly 40% of the world's population and accounts for a combined GDP that rivals the G7. These nations are actively building financial systems, trade networks, and diplomatic frameworks that function independently of Western institutions. They're creating development banks that don't impose the same austerity conditions as the IMF. They're establishing currency swap agreements that reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar. They're constructing infrastructure corridors that connect continents without requiring American approval or participation. And here's what makes this absolutely critical to understand. Trump's approach to foreign policy, characterized by maximum pressure campaigns, unilateral sanctions, tariff wars, and openly transactional relationships, has accelerated this process exponentially. When the United States weaponizes the dollar, when it seizes foreign assets, when it withdraws from international agreements on a whim, when it treats sovereign nations like vassal states that exist solely to serve American interests, those nations start asking themselves a very reasonable question. Why should we remain dependent on a system that can be turned against us at any moment? Let's talk about what happened with Russia, because it's the perfect case study. After the conflict in Ukraine began, the United States and its European allies implemented what they called the most comprehensive sanctions regime in history. They froze Russian central bank assets. They kicked Russian banks out of SWIFT. They banned imports of Russian oil and gas. The entire Western political and media establishment told us that Russia's economy would collapse within months, that the ruble would become worthless, that Putin would be forced to capitulate or face domestic uprising. Remember those predictions? Remember how confidently they were delivered? Well, here we are, and Russia's economy didn't collapse. In fact, Russia redirected its energy exports to China, India, and other Asian markets. It developed alternative payment systems. It strengthened economic ties with nations that refused to join Western sanctions, and in doing so, it demonstrated to the entire global South that there is life after American economic warfare. Countries watching this unfold drew a very simple conclusion. Diversification isn't just smart policy, it's existential necessity. If the United States can freeze billions of dollars in assets belonging to a nuclear-armed power like Russia, what's stopping them from doing the same to us if we step out of line? Now let's turn our attention to China because this is where the restructuring of global power becomes even more apparent. The United States has spent years trying to contain Chinese economic and technological development. We've seen export controls on semiconductors, restrictions on 5G technology, attempts to decouple supply chains, military encirclement through expanded alliances in the Indo Pacific, and endless rhetoric about defending the quote unquote rules based international order. And yet, despite all of this, China continues to expand its economic influence across the global south through the Belt and Road Initiative, continues to make breakthroughs in advanced technology, continues to forge deeper partnerships with nations in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. What Trump and the American foreign policy establishment fundamentally misunderstand is that you cannot bully nations into submission anymore, not in a world where alternatives exist. When the United States tells countries they have to choose between doing business with China or doing business with America, many of them are choosing China, or more accurately, they're choosing to maintain relationships with both and refusing to accept the premise of forced alignment. They're engaging in what some analysts call hedging strategies, where they maximize their options and minimize their vulnerabilities by diversifying their partnerships. Look at what's happening in Latin America, a region that the United States has historically treated as its backyard, where American corporations and government agencies have orchestrated coups, funded death squads, imposed structural adjustment programs, and extracted resources with impunity for over a century. Today, leftist and progressive governments have been elected in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and other nations, and these governments are explicitly rejecting the Washington Consensus. They're pursuing economic sovereignty, nationalizing resources, expanding social programs, and building regional integration mechanisms that don't include the United States. When Trump threatens these nations with tariffs or economic punishment, when he refers to their countries in derogatory terms, when he treats their leaders with open contempt, he's not projecting strength. He's revealing the desperation of a declining hegemon that can no longer command obedience through sheer intimidation. The same dynamic is playing out in the Middle East, where we're seeing a historic rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered not by the United States, but by China. Think about how extraordinary that is. For decades, American foreign policy in the Middle East has been predicated on maintaining division, on playing Sunni powers against Shiite powers, on ensuring that regional cooperation never develops to the point where these nations could chart an independent course. And now China, not the United States, is facilitating dialogue and de-escalation. Saudi Arabia is considering joining BRICS. The Saudis are discussing selling oil in currencies other than the dollar. The petrodollar system, which has been a cornerstone of American financial dominance since the 1970s, is facing unprecedented challenges, and Trump's transactional approach to these relationships, his open admission that American military support is contingent on payment, his treatment of these nations as client states rather than sovereign partners, is driving them to seek alternatives. Even in Europe, which has been the most reliable bloc of American allies, we're seeing cracks in the facade. France has been pushing for European strategic autonomy for years. Germany has been reluctant to fully decouple from Russian energy, despite American pressure. Hungary and other Central European nations have maintained economic ties with China, even as Brussels and Washington demand conformity. The war in Ukraine has temporarily papered over some of these divisions, but the underlying tensions remain. European nations are increasingly aware that their economic interests don't always align with American geopolitical objectives, that subordinating their economies to American strategic priorities comes with real costs, and that the United States under Trump or any future administration is an increasingly unreliable partner that will abandon commitments when convenient. What we're witnessing is the collapse of the unipolar moment, that brief period after the fall of the Soviet Union when the United States stood as the sole superpower, when Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history, when American policymakers believed they could reshape the world according to their vision without constraint or consequence. That era is over, and it's not coming back, regardless of who sits in the White House. The material conditions that enabled American hegemony, overwhelming economic dominance, unmatched military superiority, control over global financial systems, cultural soft power, have eroded significantly. China's economy is now comparable to America's by some measures. Russia has demonstrated that it can withstand Western economic warfare. The global South is more organized and assertive than at any point since the non-aligned movement of the Cold War era. Trump's response to this changing landscape has been to double down on the tactics of coercion. More sanctions, more tariffs, more military spending, more threats, more demands for tribute from allies. But here's the thing about coercion. It only works when you have overwhelming power and when your targets have no alternatives. The United States no longer enjoys that position. Every time Trump threatens a country with sanctions, that country accelerates its efforts to build economic resilience outside the dollar system. Every time he demands that allies increase their financial contributions to military alliances, those allies question whether the relationship is worth the cost. Every time he treats international law and multilateral institutions with contempt, he validates the argument that these structures are merely tools of American power rather than genuine frameworks for cooperation. And let's be honest about what American foreign policy has actually delivered to the world. We're told that the United States is defending democracy, human rights, and the rules-based order, but the record tells a different story. The United States has supported dictatorships when they serve American interests. It has invaded countries based on fabricated evidence. It has drone-bombed wedding parties and hospitals. It has imposed sanctions that have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. It has backed coups against democratically elected governments. It has extracted wealth from the global South through debt mechanisms and unequal trade relationships. So when American leaders lecture the world about values and norms, is it any surprise that much of the world responds with skepticism, if not outright derision? The nations that are pushing back against American hegemony aren't doing so because they're inherently anti-American or because they're being manipulated by China or Russia. They're doing so because they're pursuing their own interests, because they're tired of being subordinated to someone else's agenda, because they recognize that the current global system is structured to benefit a small group of wealthy nations at the expense of everyone else. They want a multipolar world where their voices matter, where they can develop their economies according to their own priorities, where they're not subjected to regime change operations every time they elect a leader that Washington doesn't approve of. Trump and his administration have tried to frame this resistance as aggression, as revisionism, as a threat to international stability. But from the perspective of these nations, they're simply claiming the sovereignty and dignity that should be their right. When China invests in infrastructure in Africa, the United States calls it debt trap diplomacy. But African nations are making their own decisions about whether these partnerships serve their interests. When Latin American countries nationalize their resources, Washington cries about property rights, but these are resources located in their territory that were being extracted by foreign corporations paying minimal taxes and leaving environmental devastation in their wake. When Middle Eastern nations refuse to isolate Iran or Russia at America's behest, the foreign policy establishment talks about maintaining stability, but what they really mean is maintaining a regional order that serves American interests. The tragedy is that the United States could play a constructive role in a multipolar world. It has technological capabilities, economic resources, and diplomatic experience that could contribute to addressing global challenges like climate change, pandemic preparedness, poverty reduction, and conflict resolution. But that would require fundamentally rethinking American foreign policy, abandoning the pursuit of full-spectrum dominance, accepting that other nations have legitimate interests that sometimes conflict with American preferences, and engaging with the world as a partner rather than a hegemon. Trump has shown no interest in this kind of transformation, and frankly, neither has the broader American political establishment, which remains deeply committed to maintaining primacy regardless of the cost. So what does all of this mean practically? It means that we're entering a period of increasing instability As the old order breaks down and a new one has yet to fully emerge, it means that economic and political conflicts are going to intensify as the United States tries to hold on to its privileged position, while rising and re-emerging powers demand a greater share of global influence. It means that we could see increased militarization, more proxy conflicts, more economic warfare, and potentially direct confrontations between major powers. This is an incredibly dangerous moment, and the American public needs to understand what's actually at stake. The narrative we're fed by corporate media and political leaders is that America is under threat from hostile foreign powers that want to undermine our way of life. The reality is that the American empire is in decline, and rather than managing that decline intelligently and transitioning to a more cooperative international system, our leaders are thrashing around, alienating allies, provoking adversaries, and making the situation worse. Trump's approach is particularly reckless, but the problem is much deeper than any individual politician. It's structural, it's bipartisan, and it requires a fundamental reimagining of America's role in the world. Till that happens, we're going to continue seeing world leaders gang up against American demands, continue seeing the construction of alternative institutions and systems, and continue moving toward a multipolar world, whether Washington likes it or not.